Hej, det er John fra Everyday Sexism Project Danmark. Det du skal høre nu, det er en talk mellem Laura Bates, som er journalist og forfatter. Så er det Sem, talsperson for Everyday Sexism Project Danmark, modereret af Maja Kalke Lorentzen fra Cybernauterne. God fornøjelse. Ja.
And hi, Lawrence, and are you looking forward to a conversation?
Absolutely.
Yes. Well, we're here because we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Everyday Sexism Project Danmark, an organization and whose work I've followed personally for all those years. But Laura, you founded the Everyday Sexism Project in the UK back in 2012. Can you maybe share a little bit of an origin story with us? Like, what inspired you to do that, and why did you choose the format that you did?
I had a really bad week, honestly. It was spring of 2012. I was living in North London, and a man followed me home one day, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. He wouldn't leave me alone. And eventually, when I asked him to back off, he told me he would follow me home and he would always know where I lived. And I felt really uncomfortable and unsafe. And I stepped into a shop and I texted a male friend who lived nearby and asked if he would come and meet me. And as soon as he arrived, the man quickly walked away. And a few nights later, after going home that day and getting on with things and not telling anyone much about it, I was on the bus quite late in the evening on my way home and on the phone to my mum when I looked down and realized that the man sitting next to me had suddenly put his hand between my legs. And I panicked and froze. And then I stood up and managed to move away from him. And I said what was happening out loud because I was on the phone. So I blurted out, "I'm on the bus. This guy just groped me." I didn't use the word sexual assault because I didn't know it. I didn't know that that was what had happened. I didn't know that I could use that terminology. And everybody on the bus heard, and everybody looked out the window. Nobody said anything. Nobody stepped in or confronted the man. But more than that, nobody wanted to hear it. Nobody wanted to even make eye contact with me. It felt like they were saying, "This is your problem. You deal with this." So I got off the bus at the next stop feeling ashamed, embarrassed, frustrated. And I walked the rest of the way home and never told anybody else what had happened. And then a few days later, I was walking down the street when some men started shouting comments about my body, about things that they would do to me. And for the first time in my life, I went home and thought about those 3 incidents. And I realized that if they hadn't happened in the same week, I never would have thought twice about any one of them because it was so normal. I was so used to it. And it was the first time I ever asked myself, why? Why is this the backdrop of my daily life to feel scared, unsafe, objectified, harassed, frustrated? And why don't I ever even tell anyone when it happens? And the answer was because I had grown up in a society that had taught me, you put up with this. This is part of being a woman. Expect it, accept it. And that if you dare to speak out, you're told it was probably your own fault, or you've got the wrong end of the stick, you're overreacting, you're looking for attention. It's just boys being boys. He just likes you. Get a sense of humor, lighten up, take a compliment. Or maybe you've been drinking. Were you leading him on? What were you wearing when it happened? So this silencing effect is so acute. And I started doing a very simple thing for the first time. I just started asking other women and girls, have you ever experienced anything like this? Thinking that a few of them would have a story to tell me, 1 or 2. This is something that happened a few years ago. And of course it wasn't like that. Of course it was every woman I spoke to. And it wasn't one story from a few years ago. It was, well, on my way to meet you just now, this happened. Every single day at work, this happens. I no longer take that route because this has happened so often. I don't exercise outside anymore because of this. It wasn't just that every woman had a story. It was that the stories were so severe and so frequent that they were impacting every aspect of their daily lives. And yet, just like me, most of the women I spoke to said, until you asked me directly, I've never told anyone any of these stories before because it's normal. And so I started talking about it and I started using the word sexism. It seemed clear to me that these were stories of people being discriminated against or harassed because of their sex. But when I did, it turned out that was much more controversial than I could have anticipated. People said, but sexism doesn't exist anymore. Women are equal now. You're looking for something to complain about. You're making a fuss about nothing. And of course, when I looked at the statistics in everything from parliamentary representation to on-screen representation, from the media to science, from engineering to our newspapers, I realized that the reality was that women were not equal. Sexism hadn't gone away. So how to bridge this gap between a society that believes the problem doesn't exist and an entire half of the population whose lives are being shaped by it daily. I didn't think I could fix sexism overnight, but I thought perhaps the crucial first step is getting people to see it. And so that's why the project was born. It was partly to be a space for survivors to have their stories heard and believed in a safe place where nobody was going to doubt them or tell them they reacted wrong, to realize it wasn't their fault and that they weren't alone. But it was also a space, hopefully, to raise awareness. And I thought that 50 or 60 people would share their stories. And of course, instead, 250,000 testimonies were shared, and it became the biggest data set of its kind that had ever been assembled, which meant that we were able to move from awareness raising to action and to international expansion.
And can you tell us a little bit about the database? Was that like your initial thought, like I need to create a space where we can collect these stories, or
Yeah, I mean, the initial idea was very much, it was, I need somewhere to send people when they tell me sexism doesn't exist. I need something to point to say, here's your proof. And I realized very quickly how much harder it is to dismiss 10 women saying the same thing. All of those excuses. She's making it up. She's looking for money. She wants attention. She's got the wrong end of the stick. You can't say that about 250,000 people all saying the same thing. So initially that was the idea. But then when it grew so exponentially, what I realized was that actually we could use subsets of that data in really targeted ways offline. So we used the stories that we had received from young women at school, for example, to go into Parliament and to say to MPs, there is nothing on the curriculum for children to learn anything about consent or healthy relationships. And in the meantime, here are 10,000 girls telling you in their own words that they are being harassed and abused and raped at school. Those two things don't make sense. So we were able to change the national curriculum alongside lots of other brilliant women's organizations. We were able to take just the stories that had come from women on buses and tubes and trains and use them directly to retrain 2,000 British transport police officers to totally change the way that they policed offences on the transport network, because there was so much they didn't understand about victim blaming, about difficulties reporting, about the nuanced and intersectional nature of the problem. And it raised reporting of sexual offences on the network by about 30%, but also crucially the detection of offenders raised by around a third as well. So it started out as very simply, look, here's the problem, you can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore. And that kind of moved and changed over time to much more targeted, let's take these entries and try and change this thing.
Yeah, here's what the problem looks like,
Yeah.
and here are the solutions. Thank you, Laura. Sen, you were one of the people who, made Everyday Sexism Project Denmark into an association and started the work here. Can you tell us about your motivation and the other people involved in that process for creating a Danish version of the Everyday Sexism Project?
Yeah. Well, it started with some of the women in the beginning asking Laura if we can have a Danish page, and we started collecting. I think we have something like 4,500 experiences now, and what it was like was that in the beginning we were like, okay, so all of these experiences coming in, and we started meeting a lot of other people that wanted to do something about it. And well, in Denmark, everybody who has a common interest forms an association. So it was very, it was sort of like a natural next step for us. But we could, of course, have just been a part of any other women's organization or association. But the thing is that we felt like we are still just a volunteer-driven association or society, and we don't have an office, we don't have any employees, and that is because we are sort of like a grassroots organization. We are people who are very into activism, and if we had been put under a formal association, which there are many very good ones in Denmark, then we wouldn't have been able to speak so openly, and that's why we still feel there's a need for us, because we are not reliant on public funding, and so we don't have to compete in that matter, and we can speak our minds in a whole different way to, for example, MPs or the media. because we don't have like a risk of losing anything. So that was actually why we wanted to form an association in Denmark. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit, both from the UK and I guess globally, but also here from Denmark, how was the project initially received back in 2012 and 2015? Were people like, oh yes, that's great, or did you like experience a lot of pushback from the get-go?
Yeah, there was always a lot of backlash. I think it was 3 weeks after I first started the website, so it was still tiny. It hadn't had any media coverage yet. We had maybe, I don't know, 100 entries or something like that when I first woke up to hundreds and hundreds of death threats and rape threats. And it was in 2012, so it's hard to imagine now, because I think now it's so ubiquitous, but back then it wasn't something that had really been talked about, this phenomenon, and it was a real shock. And it was the shock of the experience of how bad the backlash was, and the fear and the very direct, specific threats of violence. But also for me at the time, I think the shock of how anybody could take something so simple and perceive it as such an extreme threat that they felt they needed to respond in that way. I mean, right from the beginning, we had accepted stories from people of all genders. You know, we were not going out there at the beginning saying we hate men and this is about destroying men, obviously, because it never was and never has been. So that was a shock. But also societally, beyond that small but concentrated minority of men who presented such backlash, there was also a really significant, more mainstream pushback as well. Right, so politicians who just kind of ridiculed us, who thought it was ridiculous. I remember having meetings with politicians who would either kind of openly laugh in your face or would say things like, "You're very glass half empty. You know, you girls have never had it so good. You don't know how lucky you are. It used to be much worse. You should think yourselves lucky."
Yeah, no one's catcalling me in the streets.
Yeah, and bearing in mind, this is in the context of a society in which, you know, less than 2% of reported rapes result in a charge or summons. UK police respond to 1 million incidents related to violence against women and girls every year, which is around 3,000 per day. So there was that mainstream resistance very much, and in the press coverage as well, very much so. Right from the beginning, it was a case of, we'll have you on to talk, but we're going to have a man to tell you how stupid you are and you've got to fight it out. And then the other thing, the thing that kept you going, was the response from women and girls. The overwhelming outpouring of, finally someone believes me, finally I realize I'm not alone. And you know, really early on we had a story that came in really early from a woman in her 80s who said, "I have too much to say in a small box, so here are some highlights arranged by decade." And she wrote that she'd spent her whole life believing that she was to blame for the sexual assault she'd experienced, for the rape that she had experienced as a young woman, and that she had lived with this shame and this weight and burden, and that it was the first time it felt that it was lifted, because she saw all of these other women and she knew it wasn't her and she wasn't alone. And there was another woman who wrote that she had reported discrimination in her workplace because it had given her the strength to realize that it wasn't just normal and she didn't have to put up with it. There was another woman who was a runner, and she was out running one night, and she said that a man wound down his window and asked her for directions, and when she went over to help him, he reached out and grabbed her breasts and sexually assaulted her. And she said, as a runner, that she had experienced harassment so many times and abuse so many times, and that this time felt different because amidst the usual feelings of panic and rage and shame and anger, she felt this sense of solidarity of all of these other women standing alongside her, because she'd read the project entries. She knew she wasn't alone. And for the first time, she reported the guy who was then arrested for assault. So it was a really mixed reaction, but the reactions from women and girls were the thing that made it possible to carry on in spite of the backlash.
And maybe that's also the cause of the backlash, that you can actually see that this is something that has a real impact for the conversation. Sen, what about back when you started in Denmark? How was it received in with the very equal country of Denmark?
I think that I think the thing is that, as Laura is saying, I have my own story, and every woman has a story that starts, maybe when you're 6 or 7 or 8 years old. And for me, it was a man that exposed himself. I think I was 6, and then going on to all the endless times I've experienced harassment and also assault. So, but I think I've grown up in a family of very strong women, and so I always felt like that it was something that was my own responsibility. But I've, as many others have, many times heard that you just have to say no, you just have to slap the guy. I've tried that once, and him and his friends chased me and my friends after that. But anyway, so it's I think a lot of Danish women have grown up with the sense that we are very strong women in Denmark, and also the tale of that we are very an equal society, and which is also true in many formal ways. But when I saw the Everyday Sexism Project and all the entries, I realized the thing that you shouldn't have to say no, that you shouldn't have to actually put yourself at risk. It starts somewhere else. It starts with the perpetrator, and that we should do something about that. So I think that what happened then was we did the same thing as you, Laura. We tried to put all the experiences in different topics, and one of the first things we started with was transport and harassment in transport. We had a very good help from Sophie Hagen, who's Danish and also been UK-based comedian, because she also experienced something in a Danish bus, and we started collecting. We had a lot of different experiences, and we wrote the transport minister, who is incidentally today the Minister of Equality. So which is, but that was 10 years ago, and he actually responded very positively and said we have to do something about this, and then he did nothing. So but the backlash, I think, for us has been different than for you, Laura, because we have always been very anonymous. We've always, presented ourselves in our social media posts and so on as this is the spokesperson for Everyday Sexism. No names. We have been very careful about using names. I do have a secret address because of harassment, but I mean, it hasn't been as violent. And I think that's because we have put our name of the organization before the individuals. The few times that we have experienced something has been because of the media, and they put the names out and so on. But I think what we have been mostly worried about is that we have to discuss a lot of other things than what we are actually doing. Like what you're saying, we have to all the time defend ourselves against people saying, you hate men, and all you want to do is bring men down. And this is the reason why so many people are angry with us. So it has always felt like a bit strange, because we're like, okay, but there's no real, it's not a real thing. The things that they accuse us of, the reason that they get angry with us is not something that we are doing. It's something that they're hearing. So and that's been like that from the beginning. So we've experienced the same as Laura. We've experienced a lot of positive reactions, but also, of course, a lot of very angry, typically men. And we've had a couple of shitstorms, publicly, because of the media misrepresenting our what we've been saying. We had a headline at one point because we criticized the national, the men's soccer team, because they were. It's a very common thing in the soccer world to celebrate with calling out big boobs. That's just a hooray sort of like thing that
Yeah.
goes on.
You
And
yell big boobs instead of hooray.
yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of hooray, you yell big boobs. And they do it like you can hear it from 12 or 13 years old boys yelling out big boobs when they win. And they, of course, the national soccer team is why they do it, because, that it's normalized. And at one point we criticized it, and the headline was, angry feminists demand that they censor the national soccer team. And we were like, we never said that. We're not angry. I mean, it's not, we're just saying, maybe you should think about how this affects all the little boys and girls playing soccer all around Denmark. So these are the times that we've experienced a lot of public backlash is, and this was like, we had so many mails and messages on social media just with the words big boobs. And, and also, of course, you must have small boobs since you don't like it, and so on. So it's
That's
just
the classic.
yeah. It's all the normal stuff. But I mean, it's never, we sort of feel like it's never been about what we're actually saying.
No, it really is. Yeah.
It's what they think they're hearing.
It's so funny. I don't know if you've ever seen any old like anti-suffragette posters. So the movement like working for women's right to vote. The anti-suffragette posters are exactly the same types of arguments or stereotypes as we see now. So it's like, at the suffragette meetings, you can see all these like old hags and they can't get a man. So that's why they're fighting to vote, and they want to put men in the kitchen so they can go out and do things. It's like, and they're man haters and so on. It's just very funny that it's the same tropes which don't really engage with what you're actually trying to say. But I'm glad you mentioned like this, the football chant and so on, because you talked about, you both started out with addressing harassment in public life, and all the testimonies that came out where you can't really deny that, okay, this is actually happening. And I think to most people they can see, even though they maybe wouldn't have called it assault back then, that it is harassment and that it is assault. But when you move into the territory, because that's something that both your organizations have worked on, right, is like gendered language. And, the problem of sexist language. What are some of the, themes that you've addressed here, and did you find that to be more difficult for, like, to talk to people about? Because so many people, I guess, are also like, well, it's just words. One thing is assault, but words can't be violence and so on. How is that like starting that conversation?
Really difficult because it's so easily manipulated and made to look like you're, overzealous feminazis trying to police people's thoughts. And it's really hard as well, of course, to demonstrate, like with the brilliant pyramid here, to really demonstrate why it matters and to really explain. Of course, nobody is saying that sexist language is the same as rape. Nobody is saying they should be policed in the same way. Nobody is saying that one leads directly to another. But what we are saying is that there is a spectrum and a connection here. What we are saying is that if it is acceptable to shout at women in the street using a particular form of gendered language, then what that's really doing, instead of being just a compliment, is setting up a form of gendered power imbalance in our society that is a social contract that we agree to, where we're basically saying when women and girls' bodies are in public spaces, they're public property, that men have a sense of entitlement to say anything they like about them, and that it is that sense of gendered power imbalance and of male entitlement to women's bodies that is at the root of more serious abuses. So it's a very difficult thing, I think, to tackle. In fact, I remember there was a feminist group in the UK called Let Toys Be Toys, and they specifically focused on gender segregation within children's clothes and toys. And when they gently pointed out that it wasn't useful, for example, in a country where less than half of girls take physics at A-level, to have physics toys on a shelf that says boys' toys in the toy store, our biggest selling daily newspaper called it a sinister attempt at social engineering. So there is this real reaction against any critique of gendered language, and yet the impact is so significant. We know that 71% of young people in the UK hear words like slut and slag used towards girls at school more than once a week. So it is so normalized, and it contributes, of course, to that wider dehumanization of women and girls, that wider objectification. It's so significant, but it's so overlooked, and that makes it a really difficult thing to get people to take seriously.
I think also what we see is we've had a whole campaign around the media and the language that they use for victims of sexual assaults, to have them stop saying sex abuser or sex. He's a sex convict. We've been telling them for years, do not say sex about these things. First thing, you cannot. You don't have a criminalization of sex. You have a criminalization of assault and rape. So it's not, it's not the right language to use. But also, what you're taking is the perpetrator's perspective, because he or she thinks that this is about sex, but it isn't. It's about power, and it's about assault. It's about violence, and we actually have, I think, succeeded in a lot of the big media in Denmark have said and pledged that they will try not to use that kind of language. And that's a very good and I think real way that we've made a change, and also not make them not hide the perpetrator in the headlines. For example, saying, a woman was killed. We're not mentioning a man killed a woman, a man killed his partner, whatever. And also not using the words tragedy, family tragedy, as if it's something, that just happened out of the blue and you couldn't prevent it. So I think we've been successful in actually changing a lot of things in the media around language, and also I think it's the thing is that what's happened in these 10 years, I see very clearly that when we started up, there was a lot of things that were normalized saying. And what has happened now is that a lot of people have understood, it's not okay to say these things. But what they do instead now is say that it's a joke. They use humor as an excuse for doing the same things, being degrading towards girls and women. But instead now they're just saying, it's just a joke. So don't you? And this is a very big thing, I think, in England as well. But in Denmark, it's a very big thing that you have to have a sense of humor. So to be exposed to people saying, you don't have a sense of humor, that's why you don't laugh, and just take it a little bit lightly. It sort of like hurts in the core of the Danish spirit, because we're saying to ourselves that we're, we can joke about everything. We can joke about kids being killed or whatever. And that's, so what we're trying to tell them is that it has an effect, because you can't just say, it's Schrödinger's douchebag. You can't just say that this is, this is funny, because that if the person understands it and it says, I agree, then you wouldn't say that it was for fun, because this is what you actually meant. So what we use a lot to explain people why it's important is the pyramid that we made with inspiration from 11th principle consent, which is the rape pyramid. But our pyramid is a way of trying to explain to people how these things affect each other. We're not saying that telling a rape joke leads to you committing rape, but what we're saying is that we have studies showing, the man box studies showing that men that believe in very stereotypical masculinity, sort of like it's like 19 rules of stereotypical views on masculinity. For example, to be very self-reliant, not talk about your feelings, be able to use violence if somebody degrades you, control your partner, and so on. And the men that believe the most in this are also the men that are 35 times as likely to have frequently verbally harassed women publicly, and 8 times more likely to have sexually assaulted or used sexual violence against a partner. So we can show that there is actually a connection, and that we have to be very aware that when we use language, and very gendered language, and language which is based on gendered stereotypes, and it has a real life effect also when you present it as a joke.
Laura, I'd like to come back to like your initial bad week. You mentioned in the bus that nobody intervened. So some of the solutions that you've presented, Everyday Sexism Project has presented, and also other feminist organizations, is like bystander approaches and also understanding the concepts of consent. How do you feel that those kind of constructive solutions have fared? Do people take them up? Is it like, do you feel like more people are, are feeling encouraged to be bystanders and to understand these concepts of like, okay, we shouldn't do this, but how do we do it differently then?
Yeah, I think we're getting there slowly. I think for a very long time, we focused largely on victims, occasionally on perpetrators, and rarely on bystanders at all. And I think that what was so clear to me that night on the bus was the enormous impact of the people around us. They had a massive impact on me. They made me feel I was overreacting. I was making a fuss about nothing, that I potentially was to blame for what had happened myself in some way, that I shouldn't bother anyone, that I shouldn't tell anyone else, that I certainly shouldn't, think that I deserved any kind of support for what had happened, because clearly people thought it was completely normal and acceptable. But I also think it had a really significant impact on the man sitting next to me. I think about that man all the time because I wonder what he went on to do next. I wonder about the other young women that he might have sat down next to on the next bus or the next tube or train. And I wonder about what he might have done because he had been so emboldened, perhaps, by learning that he could sexually assault someone in public. And even if they said out loud what was happening, nobody would do anything to stop him. So I always use this example when I'm teaching young people in schools, when we're working about the importance of kind of bystander action and intervention, because I say, I know you might be wondering, what difference does it make if I do one small thing in my one small sphere? And I always say to them, it would have made a huge difference to me. It might have made an even bigger difference in the lives of I don't know how many other women and girls that man came into contact with afterwards. But I also think it would have made a difference to the other people sitting on the bus. Because of course I don't believe that those people all sat in silence because they were pleased about what was happening or they really believed that women deserved to be assaulted. I think most of them were scared, panicked, confused. They didn't know what to do. Perhaps they would have wanted to do something, but they kind of in the moment weren't quite sure how or what it would look like. So I think one of the things that has been really successful in the last 10 years or so is that feminist organizations have really managed to get into the mainstream this idea of bystander intervention not looking like a one-size-fits-all approach. I think people are scared that when we ask them to be allies or active bystanders, we're asking them to suddenly start a massive confrontation, or we're asking them to like pull out a placard that they had in their pocket and go on a march spontaneously and start signing petitions. And actually, I think it's really been successful, that feminist messaging around the 5Ds. You can intervene directly, you can distract from the situation without a direct confrontation, you can delegate to somebody else by letting them know about the situation and they can take action. You can delay, you can support somebody afterwards when it's safe to do so, or report something afterwards, and you can document. You can take a photo or a video if it's safe to do so. You can, in a workplace situation, note down what happened and when and who was present. You can save emails and documentation. And we are seeing evidence, I think, of that really reaching a mainstream consciousness. In the UK, we are starting to see, for example, on public transport now, we have a campaign of lots of posters which actually give examples of what those different approaches for bystanders look like in different situations, which is, I think, quite radical when you consider that when we started out just over 10 years ago, the posters that we were seeing said things like, avoid becoming a victim of rape. And they told women, there was another one that said, don't let a happy night out turn into a morning full of regret. And it had an image of a woman sprawled on the floor after an assault, but with an alcohol bottle next to her. So to now see posters which are specifically directing bystanders, these are successful and safe ways that you can step in. Or we're also seeing public awareness campaigns now in the UK specifically targeting men and boys. There's a campaign about starting with looking at yourself and talking to your friends. There's another campaign about saying mate to a mate, which is about when a man is harassing in your social group, might be harassing a woman in front of you, to say mate, which sounds, I know, very simple, but the idea behind it is, as a man, to make it socially uncool to do that to women. And there was a lot of backlash against that campaign, interestingly. There was a sense of kind of trivialization of the issue, but it came from Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, who has also done a lot of more systemic work as well. And I think we have to have all these different tools in our arsenal, and I think anything that is specifically getting men and boys to think about what is my role in this, and not necessarily perpetrators actually, but the vast majority, the critical mass of men and boys who would not themselves be committing acts of harassment, but who believe that they're a good guy by doing nothing. They think that if they're not part of the problem, that's enough. And actually moving towards a societal imperative to say it needs to go further. It's not enough to do nothing. You need to be part of the solution. That's a really positive thing.
Absolutely. I remember some of these posters, like, I don't know which country they were from, but like, she was passed out drunk, so naturally I called her a cab home or whatever. I was in a 7-Eleven at the Town Hall Square recently, and this guy came in, and he got like a Coke, and like, oh, can I get a snack? And then he looked at me and my girlfriend, he was like, could you come out? There's a really drunk girl outside, and I would just feel much more comfortable if you two were talking to her. Like, I don't want her to feel like I just want to help her, but I think we should have 2 women there as well. So it's just, I don't think that conversation would have happened 10 years ago, for instance. He was just very aware of not wanting to scare her, and also not wanting to seem like a dodgy person who wanted to take advantage of her. So he just like called extra.
Yeah, I think also a very good thing about the bystander approach is that you can tell people what is wrong behavior without telling it. Because nobody likes to be told, you shouldn't be doing this and you shouldn't be doing that and you should be saying this. But you can tell them that indirectly by making those bystander workshops and campaigns and so on.
This is what you should be doing.
Yes, this is what you should do if somebody does this. And so you're not pointing fingers. You're actually saying you can be a part of the solution and not telling you because you shouldn't be doing that. And also what we've been working with is an intersectional approach to that. So we've had, we have a version of our bystander workshop, which includes, how can you be a good bystander if you experience somebody who's a victim of racism or ableism or whatever. So
I think that's also, a very important development over the last 10 years, that people have become more aware of the various intersections, that sexism doesn't always look the same.
Yes,
if we're to look to, before we have a short break and you can all think of your questions, the crystal ball, like when we sit here in 10 years, what have we focused on, and where do you hope we've moved the needle?
Well, I think we have really focused on an intersectional approach. I think that's been a big feature of certainly the feminist movement in the UK over the last decade, has been a recognition of the need to tackle white supremacy and colonialism within feminism itself as well as outside, and a recognition of the need to make sure that we are thinking about in our solutions the intersectional nature of the problem, because if we don't, that we leave women behind. And actually for me, the Everyday Sexism Project has been really useful in that, because as a society, again, we're so bad at this. We're so bad at going, oh, we'll talk about disabled women over here. Like, we'll have a commission about disability, and we'll have Black History Month, and we'll have International Women's Day. And these are separate things experienced by separate groups of people. And the project entries, one thing that we found has been a really useful way of using them has been to say, listen to these stories of women's lived experiences, and they will illustrate to you what we mean by intersectionality. It's not a scary academic concept. It's a Black woman waiting to give the keynote speech at a conference and being interrupted by people asking if they can bring her refreshments because they assume that she's a member of staff at the venue rather than a speaker. It is a disabled woman being told to do a pole dance around her walking stick in the street. It is women who find that harassment escalates significantly if they are in public holding hands with a female partner. It is older women who again and again use the word invisible in their project entries. It is, Islamophobic harassment that is also sexual harassment and so on. And actually being able to show people what that looks like has been, I think, really helpful in terms of recognizing what we mean when we talk about intersectionality. In terms of where we go next, where we move forward to, I think the digital frontier is becoming ever more the front line of what we are facing and what we are fighting. I think the intersection between male supremacy and white supremacy and the push towards the far right in governments around the world is an existential threat for feminism and for women. And I think that's going to be a very significant battleground. I think the advent of AI and emerging technologies presents very specific and urgent risks that we need to tackle. And I also think that we continued, 10 years on, almost 15 years on from the UK project starting, we continue to face a threat for survival. The frontline women's sector continues to be on its knees, desperately scrabbling to keep the doors open. We are losing rape crisis centres by the year. We have women on waiting lists for counselling and support, which are thousands of survivors long. So I think that continues to be a really important focus as well.
I think I would like to add to that I find it interesting that when you talk about the digital violence against women and girls that you've described so greatly in your book that you can buy here, I think it's interesting that the conversation around sexism in the digital world or in technology is described in sort of like a parallel way that we are talking about the harming sides of masculinity, because you're talking about technology as something that can bring so many good things, but inherently there is going to be something bad and we can't really do something about it. It's sort of like a natural thing when we evolve. And it's the same way that we're talking about harmful masculinity, that, most of men are good, so this is just something that we have to learn to live with. It's sort of like inevitable, and we can't do anything about it. And I think we have to have that discussion, we have to have that public debate around technology, because it's built vastly by men or in their, some of their dreams, and it's so differentiated. I mean, there's so many ways, and we lump it all in together and say, well, it's all the same. So, when you talk about sex robots or AI girlfriends, it's like, but you can't really do something about the violence and so on, because you also you have to just accept it because you can actually cure cancer. And I'm like, these are two very different things.
And also, I have to say, AI cannot cure cancer. We're gonna have to take a break, but let's definitely get back to the tech aspect. I really also want to bring up forward some of the points from your new book, and I'm sure that all of you have a lot of questions. But we're going to take a short break, and we'll start again with the Q&A at 1:15.